We're going to have a joint debate on taxation. First, we will discuss the report that is submitted by Ms. Magdalena ALVAREZ on administrative cooperation in the field of taxation. The next item will be mutual assistance for the recovery of claims relating to taxes, duties and other measures, submitted by Mr. Stolojan. Then we'll talk about optional and temporary application of the reverse charge mechanism in relation to supplies of certain goods and services susceptible to fraud. And now I would like to pass the floor to Ms. Alvarez. You've got 4 minutes.
Gracias, señor presidente, queridos colegas.
Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen, the European Union is based on a principle of solidarity between member states. One clear example of this solidarity is to be found in administrative cooperation in the field of taxation. This is considered to be one of the keystones of the way in which the European Union operates. The idea is to create a sense of trust and confidence between member states and their administrations. This has to be based on a sense of confidence and the certainty that other member states will help tax authorities and make it difficult for tax frauders or evaders to hide them. Tax fraud and evasion has very serious consequences in the economy of a country. It reduces their ability to raise money and instigate revenue. It's very important to set an example to citizens about the need to respect tax legislation. All the effects of tax evasion are extremely worrying in the European Union, and according to most recent assessments, the cost of this is some 2 billion euros per year. This is twice as much as the cost of the recovery plan as proposed by the European Commission. In other words, we find ourselves faced with an enormous challenge, something which we have to face up to with a real sense of resolve and determination. It's true to say that the current directive did represent a step in the right direction. It has all sorts of good intentions. Unfortunately, however, its practical implementation hasn't been very effective. The time has now come for us to take a great step forward by adopting a set of new instruments which will enable us to accompany the liberalisation of the market. In the light of this, I would like to commend the proposal made by Commissioner Kovács. I would like to congratulate the Commissioner for his work throughout his mandate, and in particular for this draft directive. This draft directive will make it possible for us to come forward with more effective measures designed to fight tax fraud in Europe. In the light of that, the new directive represents an enormous step forward in terms of quality and quantity. It sets out new obligations while at the same time strengthening existing rules. The scope has been extended, moving from the obligation to provide information on the basis of requests to automatic exchange of information, as well as raising bank secrecy. Banking secrecy has proved to be the major obstacle up until now for tax administrations pursuing in case of tax fraud. The OECD has constantly reiterated the need to remove banking secrecy, and this has been picked up by G7 and G8. The time has now come for us to adopt efficient measures which will enable us to do away with the blight of tax havens within and without the European Union. This has been one of the aspects we've dealt with. We would also like to tighten up the Commission proposals in this field. We would like to strengthen the possibility of implementing the new directive. Perhaps I could comment briefly on some of the main amendments. The idea would be to extend the scope. We would like to extend the scope of automatic exchange of information. As far as banking secrecy is concerned, we've proposed additional provisions within the directive. There's also a compromise amendment which refers specifically to the automatic exchange of information, the protection of confidential data, and the exchange of data with third countries. I'm just winding up. I would like to end by congratulating and thank our Commission colleagues for their extremely cooperative attitude. I think we have a high degree of consensus here. The European Parliament is clearly committed to fight against tax fraud and evasion. And this is one of the fundamental principles of the European Union, based on transparency, fairness and honesty. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Děkuji. Nyní pan Stolojan na 4 minuty.
Thank you, Mr. Stolojan. 4 minutes, please.
Mulțumesc, domnule.
Thank you, President. The recent economic and financial crisis has proven the major importance of solid and sustainable public finances or financial systems in the member states. Those member states which have a good governance of the public fiscal policies, anti-cyclical fiscal policies, were able to offer fiscal incentives so as to help economies to surpass the obstacles of the crisis. As a rapporteur, I do appreciate the initiative of the Commission and the draft directive of the Council meant to improve mutual assistance between member states so as to retrieve claims from taxes and duties. This directive will contribute to increasing efficiency. We shall recover claims, indeed, but this directive will also contribute to a better functioning of the single market. I would like to tell you that in the draft directive, there's a significant improvement of certain important elements related to the recovery of claims, the exchange of information between the authorities, the way in which claims can be followed, and the feedback which is so necessary to the European Commission in its monitoring process, in the monitoring of an ever-growing activity in what concerns the number of cross-border cases. There have been amendments, and I would like to thank all my colleagues who tabled these amendments which improved the quality of this directive. I would like to thank them and the Commission and the Council.
Mulțumesc, děkuji. Nyní pan CASA.
Mr. CASA, 4 minutes, please.
Grazie, President.
Thank you, President. I believe that this report will clearly show the efficiency that the European Union adopts thanks to the institutions that work together when facing a problem that requires urgent and particular attention. I believe that when we talk about the missing trader and inter-community fraud, we have to pay attention to the measures that this temporary scheme will adopt in order to stop whoever tries to take advantage of this system. This type of fraud that we have already mentioned is called missing trader inter-community is basically geared towards carousel fraud, which is carried out by professionals and experts in the area. And studies have shown that this type of fraud is about 24% of all the types of fraud that are carried out in regards to VAT fraud. And this happens when a person who is offering a service or selling a good receives the receipt from the VAT rather, and this VAT disappears without this person having handed it over to the treasurer. And therefore, this is carousel fraud because the VAT somehow just disappears from every country where these negotiations are being carried out. The Commission's proposal, therefore, gives the opportunity so that this risk that we are taking when it comes to this kind of abusive negotiations will eliminate the pressures that an honest tradesman would face by adding added bureaucracy. And we have to make sure that in this temporary measure we do not use it towards products that we cannot evaluate or control. And then we have to mention the ETS scheme, emissions trading scheme, because there was a change to this scheme because of the proposal from the Commission. What we are saying is that the vulnerability of the ETS scheme came out when there are vulnerable states who would be ready to carry the burden of this system, and therefore this should only concern ETS certificates that are tied to greenhouse gas emission credits that are traded, and this has to be carried out on an equal level amongst all member states. In 2012, 90% or 95% have to be generated. From 2013, the larger part of the credits have to be auctioned, and therefore, before the system is in place, we have to ensure that we do not allow people to exploit the system. When you consider that there was consensus from the European Monetary Organization and Committee, and that there was consensus between all the political groups, this should at least show that we are all willing to implement this seriously and to fight against fraud in the most serious of manner, and hopefully will be successful when it comes to VAT systems within the EU. Thank you.
Děkuji.
Thank you very much. And now, Mr. Domenici.
Grazie, signor Presidente.
Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen, the topic of good tax government, although it's already been very important, has taken on still greater topicality and import against the background of the financial and economic crisis 2 years ago. And there's been debate of it at international summits, G20 and EU summits, and this will go on, in particular when the issue of tax evasion and tax havens has been addressed. So this importance indicates a will to do something, but it doesn't go further than those statements, and there needs to be an ongoing and serious policy. There are many problems still outstanding, and it's very easy to open a phantom company to avoid tax. Just look around on the internet. You can buy a company, including in EU countries, just like that, and often all you need is an email address, and you just attach your photocopy of your passport and you can open a company. So I think this idea of phantom identities being created to avoid tax needs to be stopped. I've looked at the EU Commission communication of the 28th of April 2009. It puts forward some sound ideas, but I would address a strong request to Commission and Council that those proposals should be implemented. I think it should be regarded as an EU priority to fight tax havens and tax evasion, because it's an illegal leakage of capital. We need to base ourselves on good governments, an exchange of information, a cooperation across borders, a fair competition on tax. The point is that we need increased cooperation on tax in the EU. The general objective that we must take in hand is an automatic exchange of information on a global and multilateral footing. Obviously this must start from the European Union. The point has already been made by our colleague Mrs. ALVAREZ. We need to scrap banking secrecy in all EU countries. And without further ado, we must put an end to the temporary waivers allowing a withholding tax to be levied at source, which is often either evaded or understated to take the place of an exchange of information. I don't want to wax any longer on the specific proposals in the report, but I would emphasize that there are some particular points we need to take in hand. We need to extend the 2003 savings directive scope and deal with VAT, and we must put in place a system in the EU logging people who have opened companies or accounts in tax havens. We need to look at tax harmonisation plans beginning with the common consolidated corporate tax base. Also, the European Union needs to speak with one voice in international forums where attempts are being made to improve the standards of the OECD on information exchange to replace the on-request information exchange system. Commissioner Kovács, listen to these other reports. We need strong Commission commitment. Right now, we need the new Commission to emphasize these priorities as portfolios change. The Commission, Council and Parliament all need to take action. I'd like to thank colleagues, and above all I'd like to thank the shadows for their contributions to this work. I do hope it will be adopted by Parliament.
Grazie. Now Commissioner Kovács, please.
Thank you, and now Commissioner Kovács.
Very much, Mr. Chairman, honourable members. It's my pleasure to discuss tax matters with you this day, which is the last day of my mandate as Commissioner responsible for taxation and customs. I would like to express my thanks, first of all, to the European Parliament and especially to the ECON Committee for the support the Commission and I have received during the last 5 years for most, if not all, the tax proposals we presented. The tax policy initiatives you are currently discussing have a major role in order to achieve the Commission's objective to better tackle tax fraud and evasion, which results in a loss of €250 billion a year on EU level. And we are also aiming to increase transparency and cooperation. I would like to express my special thanks to Mr. Domenici, Madam Alvarez, Mr. Stolojan and Mr. CASA for dealing with these tax initiatives in a constructive manner. I am very pleased that the essential message of the reports is one of the support for the Commission's initiatives. I understand that the reports encourage increased efforts concerning a. Good governance in tax matters within the European Union and beyond, b. Administrative cooperation in the tax area, c. Mutual assistance in the recovery of tax claims, and d. Fight against VAT fraud, in particular carousel fraud. Concerning good governance in tax matters, the Commission's policy is aimed at promoting the principles of transparency, exchange of information and fair tax competition on a global scale. The Commission adopted the communication in April 2009, promoting these principles in order to combat cross-border tax fraud and evasion, both within the EU and beyond, and to achieve a level playing field. The Commission has tabled several proposals in order to improve good governance within the EU. The debate is ongoing on these proposals, but I hope that they will get adopted soon and it will reinforce our arguments vis-à-vis other jurisdictions to take similar steps. The Commission strongly believes that the deepening of economic relations between the EU and its partner jurisdictions should always be accompanied by commitments to good governance principles. Based on the 2008 Council conclusions, the objective is to introduce in relevant agreements with third countries a provision on the basis of which EU partners would recognise and commit themselves to implement the principles of good governance in the tax area. Particular attention needs to be paid to developing countries. Commission services are currently preparing a communication which would be dedicated to good governance in tax matters in the specific context of development cooperation. This communication will address what role good governance in tax matters can play in improving resources mobilisation in developing countries, notably through capacity building. I welcome your support to fully associate the Commission in the works of the OECD Global Forum peer review exercise, in particular with regard to the identification of non-cooperative jurisdictions, the development of a process for evaluating compliance and the implementation of measures to promote adherence to the standards. The European Commission should continue to be an active player to ensure that all partners live up to their commitments. In relation to the number, which is 12, of tax information exchange agreements for a country to conclude for achieving the status of a cooperating jurisdiction, the Commission supports the need to review it and to take qualitative aspects into account, such as first, the jurisdictions with which the agreements have been signed. To be explicitly clear, a tax haven which has 12 agreements with other tax havens would certainly not pass the threshold. Second, the willingness of a jurisdiction to continue to sign agreements even after it has reached this threshold. And third, the effectiveness of implementation. As regards your request to examine a range of options for sanctions and incentives to promote good governance in tax matters, The Commission is already examining a range of incentives to promote good governance at the EU level. For example, enhanced use of development aid in order to encourage certain third countries to move away from unfair tax competition. Work on possible sanctions is less advanced, and of course any EU action must take into account individual member states' tax policies. There are, however, two specific areas where I do not entirely agree with you. One relates to the public registries and disclosure of information concerning investors in tax havens. I think a balance must be established between privacy and the need for jurisdictions to enforce their tax laws. While there should be no restrictions on exchange on the basis of bank secrecy or domestic tax interest requirements, respect for taxpayers' rights and strict confidentiality of information exchange must apply. These limits have to be respected, so a public register may not be the best solution. The other concerns transfer pricing. You propose shifting to the comparable profit methods in order to better identify inaccurate transaction prices and the most frequently applied tax evasion techniques. In my view, while it is true that comparison with industry sector profits may be an indicator that something is amiss, that single indicator alone is not sufficient to conclusively identify inappropriate transfer pricing and could only be one factor in a much wider risk assessment of the accuracy of prices charged on transactions between subsidiaries of a multinational company. The comparative profit method is acceptable, but only if it arrives at the same result as the transactional methods. Going straight to the comparative profit method, as the amendment seems to suggest, would not necessarily give us the right arm's length answer. The proposed new directive on administrative cooperation in the field of taxation seeks to enhance and streamline all mechanisms of exchange of information and other forms of cooperation between the Member States to better prevent tax fraud and evasion. In particular, the directive proposes to withdraw bank secrecy in the relations between Member States for administrative cooperation purposes. I warmly welcome the constructive attitude and support to this proposal shown in the report of Ms Alvarez. I am aware that the most controversial point of the discussion in the committees has been the amendments related on automatic exchange of information and aiming at rendering the use of automatic exchange optional only based on a decision to be taken by the Member States. Let me recall that the objective of this proposal is to enhance within the EU all types of exchange of information and other forms of administrative cooperation, and precisely automatic exchange, which is a major pillar for preventing tax fraud and evasion. Promoting exchange of information on request as an OECD standard is certainly an acceptable approach with third countries, but in a fully integrated internal market as the EU single market is, Member States must be more ambitious and go further. They must be able to use the best instruments at their disposal to achieve their political objectives of fighting tax fraud and evasion. I notice that the draft report on good tax governance highlights the necessity to develop automatic exchange of information as a general rule, as a means to put an end to the use of artificial legal persons to avoid taxation. I also notice that the report welcomes this proposal for a new directive for administrative cooperation, as it also extends its scope to cover taxes of any kind and it abolishes bank secrecy. I therefore call you not to vote in favour of the new amendment tabled by the EPP Group to erase any reference to automatic exchange of information in the report. Concerning the amendments aiming at providing for more defined rules on the protection of private data, I would like to underline that in any case, Member States are compelled to respect the existing community legislation on this subject, and that therefore these rules will have to be respected without any further amendment of the present directive. However, for the sake of clarity, I could envisage to have a general recital referring to the existing community rules. As regards the amendments on the evaluation system and requirements, I believe that the rules foreseen in the proposal and reinforced in the Presidency compromise text should provide for an adequate framework reflecting the spirit of the proposed amendments. The Commission can accept in principle certain amendments, such as those introducing the possibility for the Commission to adopt delegated acts in respect of technical improvements to the categories of income and capital that are subject to the automatic exchange of information, while the categories concerned should be defined in the directive itself and not through comitology. This is also in line with the orientation of the ongoing Council discussions. The Commission can also accept in principle the amendments on bank secrecy, which would not distinguish between taxpayers based on their tax residency. Furthermore, the Commission also accepts in principle the amendments on the presence and participation of officers in administrative inquiries. The Commission will defend the spirit of these amendments in the Council deliberations without formally amending its proposal, as these provisions seem to be already reflected in the compromise text. Let me now turn to the Commission's proposal on mutual assistance for the recovery of taxes. National provisions on tax recovery are limited in scope to national territories, and fraudsters have taken advantage of this to organise insolvencies in Member States where they have debts. Member States therefore increasingly request the assistance of other Member States to recover taxes, but existing provisions have only allowed 5% of debts to be recovered. The Commission's proposal is intended to provide for an improved assistance system, with rules that are easier to apply and provide for more flexible conditions for requesting assistance. As you know, the ECOFIN has reached an agreement on a general approach to the DAB directive on the 19th of January. I very much welcome the supporting attitude to this proposal shown in the report of Mr. Stolojan. The Commission can accept in principle the amendment to make the exercise of inspection powers in the requested Member States by officials of the applicant Member State, subject to an agreement between the Member States concerned. This is also reflected in the Council compromise text. However, the Commission cannot accept other amendments, such as introducing systematic and automatic exchange of information in the area of recovery, because it could lead to a disproportionate administrative burden, as it would also cover unproblematic recovery situations. Nevertheless, the Commission, in cooperation with the Member States, will examine the possibilities how to further improve tax recovery assistance and address the eventual problem. Let me finally conclude with a few words on the Commission's proposal for an optional and temporary application of the reverse charge. In responding quickly to new and worrying fraud patterns reported by several Member States, the objective of this proposal is to give interested Member States the possibility, under an optional and temporary scheme, to apply the so-called reverse charge mechanism, under which it is the client who has to account for the VAT, to a limited number of highly fraud-sensitive sectors. Under the proposed directive, Member States would be able to choose a maximum of 2 categories of particularly fraud-sensitive goods, like mobile phones, and 1 category of services, like the greenhouse gas emission allowance, on which major fraud circuits have been detected over the last summer, out of a list of 5 categories. They would need to assess the effectiveness of this measure, as well as its impact on a possible shift of fraud to other Member States, to other types of supplies and other fraud patterns. I was pleased that the Council took up this proposal so quickly and reached agreement on it at the ECOFIN of 2 December. Of course, it is regrettable that agreement could only reach one part of the proposal, greenhouse gas emission allowances, but I am fully aware of the fact that this part was one where the most urgent action was needed. The Commission will continue to contribute to the Council negotiations on the remaining parts of the proposal as constructively as possible. Finally, I would like to thank the European Parliament once again for its speedy reaction, as well as for its clear support. Even though the Commission is not in the position now to formally accept all the proposed amendments, they will provide us as a useful input into the forthcoming Council debates. What is at stake is indeed our capacity to react quickly to a massive fraud mechanism, but it is also the credibility of the EU emission trading system. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Commissioner Kovács. And because, as you mentioned, this is the last occasion you came to this House, so let me also thank you for the excellent cooperation we had with you during your tenure. Thank you. Now we have speakers for our political groups. Madame Lulling is the first speaker for the European People's Party.
Thank you, President. Well, sometimes things just turn out like that. We've just been talking about protection of private life, privacy and so on, and this has been an opportunity for us to affirm a number of principles this afternoon. We've been talking about body scanners and airports, we've been talking about the agreements on this with the United States, we've been talking about defending individual liberties, All these things are going to be debated this week in the European Parliament following a series of diplomatic tensions. Now, I'm sorry that we have to attack the freedom of citizens across such a broad and varied and inconsistent front. Now, in this case, we're talking about banking privacy and the privacy of taxation arrangements. And often the good is the enemy of the best, perhaps. We, of course, in fiscal matters, have a great number of different obligatory systems in the different member states, and we have a number of across-the-board changes being proposed in the Alvarez report here. And I think if we do adopt this, it's the sort of thing that's going to be adopted like a scanner in an airport. Once you've got them, you'll never be able to get rid of them, the sorts of measure being proposed here. This set of proposals will call for a whole series of changes, bureaucratic and administrative changes throughout Europe. At the same time, we'll have the SWIFT agreement with the United States being annulled. And I honestly don't see the point of this. One can try and justify it in terms of efficiency, but I don't agree. We're talking here in the proposal of automatic notification exchange of all banking transactions. And this, of course, will lead to an unmanageable flow of data. And this, I think, will be something we won't be able to live with. I think we'll be adopting, if we adopt these proposals, a system that won't work, and it'll be much worse than what we've already got. Now, for those of us who are concerned about red tape and too much bureaucracy, I would say the only solution here is to oppose these proposals rather than adopt them and then have to live with the disastrous consequences. Let me just say something to Commissioner Kovács. He's leaving us soon. I wish him a happy retirement. You've often picked the wrong battles in your career, including on this occasion, but I won't hold it against you, so I wish you a happy retirement, Commissioner.
Merci. Mr. Portas is raising his blue card. Madame Lulling.
A brief question for Mrs. Lulling, if I may. Mrs. Lulling, would you accept a question from me? Mrs. Lulling.
May I make a question to you? Je peux faire une question?
Can I put a question to you, Mrs. Lulling? Thank you. No, I just wanted to ask you one thing, and listening to what you had to say. So you tell me, we're talking here about an automatic exchange of tax information. What's that got to do with an end to confidentiality? The two things are completely different. Most countries in Europe don't have banking secrecy. There are automatic mechanisms for circulating and exchanging tax information between the member states already. At the same time, we don't have everybody's individual fortunes being advertised on the internet, even though we have this system.
Ado, you can answer, Madame Lulling.
Monsieur le Président, mon collègue...
President, unfortunately, my colleague obviously hadn't understood anything I said. I don't have much speaking time, so what I'd like to do is talk to him in private, and I hope he's got it right and understood before we vote.
So there will be a private discussion between those two. Thank you. Obrigado. Now, Mr. Hoang Gok for the European Socialists and Democrats.
Monsieur le Président, chers collègues.
President, ladies and gentlemen, during the current recession, public finances have been plundered, so as initially to save the banks and secondly to lessen the effect of the financial crisis. We have now moved on to talk about public deficits. There's been a great deal of criticism and indeed attacks on individual member states, while at the same time people have said little about the drop in tax revenue. It's important to remember that every year 200 billion euros are subject to tax evasion. All of this money could be used in the recovery plan. All of this money would enable us to face up to the challenges of what many people call the demographic shock facing us. This is why the directives we're talking about today are so important. The setting up of common instruments, absolute transparency between member states when it comes to recovering debts, are absolutely essential if we are to ensure that no citizen or no business is able to avoid its tax liabilities and that everybody takes part in the shared effort. It's essential that tax administrations in member states have all the tools they need to do their job. It's essential that we remember just how important a healthy tax policy actually is. Everybody is currently concerned about Greece. This provides us with abundant illustrations of what happens when you don't have an effective tax administration system. It's not just the financial crisis which has been making life so difficult for the Karamanlis government. It's also the lack of willingness on the part of previous Greek administrations to carry out the necessary reforms to enable the tax authorities to collect revenue. In the light of this, we sincerely hope that the European Union will use all the tools at its disposal to help Greece. We hope that the vote which we carry out on Wednesday will confirm the result of the vote at the committee stage, thereby paving the way to an effective text enabling us to move towards more effective tax recovery. Thank you.
Madam Bowles for the Liberals.
Commissioner, I'm glad that we are debating these reports within your term, even if it's only just. The committee has worked hard to ensure that. Now, in many, in fact I would say in most things, we have had a mutually supportive dialogue, though of course we have not agreed on everything. For example, we agreed on VAT for intra-community supplies, but disagreed on joint and several liability in the framework of cross-border transactions. And in quite a few instances, we have both been disappointed by the slowness or lack of backing by member states. CCCTB is one of those proposals. But in the face of these disappointments, you have brought forward more intensive traditional controls based on cooperation, information exchange and data access. So both personally and as chair of the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee, I take this opportunity to thank you for your work and enthusiasm during your term of office. As colleagues have said, at this time of fiscal stress, enabling member states to collect their full dues of taxes is even more important. With this driving force, Council must be more progressive in future. Those who knowingly scheme to evade and avoid taxes do harm to society and should not expect leniency when they are caught, and we must have the tools to catch them. Turning specifically to the matter of administrative cooperation, I believe that automatic exchange of information is beneficial. It goes along with the Savings Tax Directive, which I hope will soon be adopted in Council. But your activism in this matter has already created positive developments, both within and beyond the EU. I also commend the directive on mutual assistance for recovery of claims, but consider a lower threshold for implementation more appropriate. And finally, I apologise to you and colleagues for not staying for the rest of the debate, but as ever, there are double bookings going on in this House. Thank you.
Thank you. Monsieur Lambert for the Greens. 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. For a few weeks now, colleagues, it's been high time to address the budget deficits in a number of member states. Now, of course, we can criticise some items of public spending. We don't refrain from doing that, such as millions of euros of subsidies for fossil fuels. But let's not forget that the deterioration of the deficit, as our socialist colleague reminded us, comes from the economic and financial crisis. I think governments aren't really responsible for the people whose riskier actions caused the debts run up by the crisis. However, we can agree that public deficits cannot be supported at the current level because they weaken Europe's potential to take the lead in a new global Green New Deal, which we so urgently need. So we need to deal with the deficits, but not just by looking at spending. We must also address revenue, which is why the reports tabled today, particularly that of Mrs. Alvarez and Mr. Domenici, are so important. By focusing on an automatic data exchange between administrations, making that the norm, we will enable ourselves to take a serious attack at tax evasion, which amounts to 200 to 250 million euros, or 2 to 2.5% of GDP. We must come up with a common tax base for the corporate sector, creating greater clarity for taxpayers and member states. This will be a step forward, but it shouldn't block competition so much as foster cooperation. We need to put an end to tax dumping, which is a downward slope which jeopardizes the assets of member states, and it's not in the interests of individuals or SMEs who don't have the ability of international corporations to play off different parties. So as for VAT, we need to put in place tax harmonisation, a progressive harmonisation of corporate tax rates on the basis of minimum thresholds. Lastly, we need to put member states' tax revenues on a sustainable basis, which means cutting tax on labour and progressive taxation of energy from non-renewable sources, and there must be a transaction and capital gains tax, but that's another kettle of fish, as my grandmother would have said. So I would congratulate Mrs. Alvarez and Mr. Domenici for excellent work, which makes more ambitious rather than overturning past positions undertaken by Parliament. Lastly, let me say to Mr. Kovács, I wasn't there when you started working, but my colleagues said that you've given a much greater impression thanks to your work since your hearing than you gave at your hearing. So we wish you all the best. Goodbye.
Mr. Ashley Fox for 1 minute. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank the rapporteurs and other shadows for the hard work they have put into producing these reports. Taxation, particularly any form of harmonisation, is always a sensitive issue. We need to balance the need to operate an efficient single market with the need to protect member state competence on taxation. I would advise Mr. Lamberts the best way to minimise tax evasion is to have simpler taxes and lower tax rates. Tax competition is a jolly good thing. It protects the taxpayer from rapacious governments. Member states must be free to sign bilateral agreements with third countries. The UK and the US readily share information because of their history of cooperation in fighting terrorism. If this information was to be shared across the EU, many third countries would refuse to sign similar agreements in the future. Cooperation would cease and national security would be put at risk. I urge members to approach these reports pragmatically. We need to ensure that we do not indulge in needless harmonisation which endangers national security. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Mr. Nikolaos CHOUNTIS for 1.5 minutes.
Ευχαριστώ, κύριε Πρόεδρε. Δεν υπάρχει αμφιβολία ότι με τις εκθέσεις γίνεται μια προσπάθεια.
Thank you, President. I think this report is an effort to achieve better cooperation between tax authorities in the European Union with respect to direct taxation. So that's to say it doesn't cover VAT and certain other forms of indirect taxation. Now, this report concentrates on the question of known forms of tax avoidance, but of course there are new kinds of tax avoidance which have arisen with the crisis, and this is exacerbated by tax competition between the member states. So there are a series of problems we have to solve there. Also, we have to tackle the question of offshore companies and offshore banking arrangements, which basically amount to money laundering operations with tax avoidance in mind. And about 10% of legitimate taxation in Greece is lost in this way, money laundering through offshore accounts and companies. So what we need here is not just a continuation of the Stability Pact, which should be monitored by the European Central Bank, but we have to find other solutions to tax evasion and tax fraud. That's to say, this is a question that has to be resolutely tackled by the Member States if we're going to have successful economic policy in the European Union.
Mr. Bloom, please.
Commissioner, Chairman, taxation as a concept hasn't really changed very much, has it, in the last 3,000 years? The rich and the powerful stealing money from ordinary people to make their own lives more comfortable. Where there has been a change in modern times is that taxation is for the benefit of the taxed, that somehow we are being taxed pro bono. In order to perpetrate this myth, we invent periodic scares to frighten people into submission. The latest of these scares is, of course, that if we don't cough up green taxes, we will all boil to death. Reminiscent of the medieval religions, isn't it, which played the same game: pay up or burn in hell. Tax harmonisation is a concept dreamed up by the modern political class to make sure that no government steals too little from its people. A sort of thieves' cartel, if you will. May I suggest that if you really want tax harmonisation, that the Commission and the bureaucracy pay the same taxes as the electorate. They bear the same burden as tax as the rest of us before the electorate storm this building and hang us from the rafters, as they've every right to do.
Thank you. Colleagues, as you have noticed, we have some problems with our board, so don't follow the board, please follow me as far as the speakers list is concerned. Now Hans-Peter Martin. Herr Martin, bitte.
Wir brauchen eine Revolution der Demokratie.
The time has come for a democratic revolution. As a young man, an accountant and a journalist, I felt obliged to pay 62% tax through a sense of conviction that we were governed by good people. Since joining the European Parliament, however, I see things somewhat differently. I've seen what happens to those millions of shillings I used to pay. And this gives me an entirely new slant on this whole debate when it comes to responsible taxation. We shouldn't so much be looking at the way it's spent. Back then, I paid 62%, and my tax advisor, who later became a minister in Austria, he said, "You're from Vorarlberg, in the western part of Austria. Go and live just across the border in Switzerland or Liechtenstein." I didn't do this, once again, out of a sense of conviction. However, I saw many other people who did it. I myself wasn't a civil servant. I wasn't an expense for the social security system. I wasn't an MEP. Looking back now, in a calm, collected way, I wonder how on earth I managed to allow people to take my hard-earned money away and waste it so blatantly. What we need is reasonable, efficient administration to use our money. What on earth do we need another 290 jobs for? Why on earth do we have to be subsidizing ski lessons? Once again, if you really do want to attract people to the European project, the European ideal, if you want to do away with tax havens, you have to start by showing a sense of responsibility in the way in which you, as our institution, spend taxpayers' money. Otherwise, people will fail to sign up to our project, and we can't really be angry with them for that, can we?
Enikő, tessék.
Mr. Chairman, tisztelt képviselőtársaim! 4%-os GDP visszaesés, 21...
President, GDP has fallen by 4%. We see unemployment, excessive deficit proceedings against 20%, and national debt reaching levels of 80%. I think it's unsustainable that so much money has been spent to try and achieve a recovery in the economy, but nothing much has been done to deal with cross-border tax claims, or not much has been done to harmonise data exchange. It's a question the governments are taking action to achieve those data exchanges. Tax evasion in the EU accounts for about twice the level of the EU budget. Now, we need to take action on banking secrecy and get rid of these semi-tax havens, even if that hurts some member states that exist within the EU. People who pay their taxes expect all of us to be on a level playing field. The Domenici report is one which doesn't aim at tax harmonisation so much as trying to get member states to work together. I've put down some amendments on the report that other groups have supported. We need to put in place a system so that member states trying to claim tax speed up cooperation and vice versa. So, secondly, I've proposed that we take action in a direction that Mr. Kovács is not keen on transfer pricing. Thirdly, we have a model convention under the OECD which has already seen 12 countries cooperating with us. Thank you.
Ludvigsson for 2 minutes.
Tack för ordet, herr talman. Vi debatterar ikväll ett antal åtgärder för att bekämpa skattebedrägeri och skatt. Några av stor vikt och det
Thank you, President. Combating tax fraud is extremely important for the European Union, and to do this we have to strengthen the instruments we have available to us for collaboration. In that way we can lay the foundations for European economic policy. So controls have to be fair and sustainable and reliable. I think also what we need is a system of automatic payment for tax arrears, as well as an automatic exchange of tax information. But the thing is, as I said before, whatever system we devise has to be worthy of trust. It has to be reliable. But I think in this way we can begin to reduce the occurrence of tax fraud. So whatever systems we have to be reliable, have to be fair, and we have to take a constructive approach, especially to tax debt arrears. And I am sure that everybody agrees that we need to devise solutions rapidly so that very soon we can have a new reliable system based on a set of criteria which we can all agree upon. So whatever we do when it comes to recovering tax arrears in Europe, there has to be solid cooperation in order to tackle what is a serious problem. And at the same time, this needs a long-term approach as well. It's not a problem we can solve overnight. So we have to, as I said before, reinforce cooperation and also conclude other international agreements with people outside or countries outside the European Union.
Goulard, 2.5 minutes.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. This package, which on the face of it appears to be quite technical, actually pertains to highly political matters. The first package is actually one of the key aspects of the internal market. I think it's very important to stress this. The free movement of people and capital is one of the key principles of the European Union, something which all of us endorse. At the same time, however, this shouldn't pave the way to any element of unfairness when it comes to taxes. Some very mobile citizens are unable to escape the tax obligations, whereas those who are obliged to stay put can't do so. Nor should this facilitate competition between member states when it comes to providing a haven for tax evasion and fraud. This is what leads to us to the idea of having a single established basis for company or corporate tax, something which has been suggested. If Mrs. Lulling had been courteous enough to stay with us this evening, I could have pointed out to her that there is indeed a question of public freedom or liberty when it comes to exchange of sensitive data. However, there's a major difference when it comes to data which member states within the European Union can exchange, that's to say within the single market and for the purpose of the single market on the one hand, and on the other hand data which can be exchanged with third countries such as the United States. In the wake of the crisis, there has indeed been a great deal of talk about the need to fight against tax havens, but also grey areas which continue to exist either in the European Union or related territories. Since the positions adopted by the G20, the citizens of Europe are waiting for concrete action on our part, and I think this has been made quite clear. Finally, I'd just like to wind up by making some comments to the Commissioner, Mr. Kovács. It's very unusual that we have the chance to bid farewell to a Commissioner, an outgoing Commissioner, on the last day of his mandate. I would also like to comment on the incoming Commissioner, Mr. Šemeta, stating that we appreciate many of the positions he set out, while welcoming the fact that Barroso II would apparently be under its commitment to deal with this matter, and Mr. Mario Monti has been drafting a report on this. It's true to say there is some reticence amongst member states, but as you pointed out, Mr. Kovács, the time has come for the Commission perhaps to move on to the offensive. Member states' coffers are empty. We have to find ways to fill them again, obviously in an intelligent and sustainable way. Thank you.
Madame Joly for 2.5 minutes.
Monsieur le Président.
President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, thanks to Mr. Domenici's work, the report that we're going to give our final verdict on this week is a high-quality document. I hope it will be approved in plenary on Wednesday. There's a lot in it on tax transparency, fighting tax havens and so on, the serious repercussions of which are emphasized here. We must note that the text takes action against tax havens based on the campaign so far. The tax convention and the list of non-cooperating jurisdictions under the OECD are not themselves satisfactory and indeed a part of the problem which they are meant to be fighting. That's why the proposals of the report, which suggest shrugging off this approach, involves the definition of a tax haven and the putting in place of effective mechanisms to fight against it, including sanctions or penalties. That's vital. Also, automatic data exchange on tax is going to be instigated both at EU and international level. This would also apply to accounts to be drawn up country by country, suggested by the report, to take into account the real assets of companies in the territory in which they're based, to ensure that they pay the tax that they are duly required to pay. These are two things that we've been calling for, or experts have been calling for some time. We can only take pleasure in the fact that the Parliament has taken up these two issues, making it the most committed institution in this fight. Ladies and gentlemen, the problem of tax havens is not a mere technical issue. It goes back to fundamental choices. Do we want to give developing countries the wherewithal to enjoy their own resources rather than seeing those taken away from them? All our businesses and individuals need to contribute as they can to the life of society. By voting for Mr. Domenici's report, we'll give an affirmative answer to those two questions, one which I hope we can be proud of. Personally speaking, I would like to thank Commissioner Kovács for the seminar we jointly held here in Brussels on the 9th of December to put this issue on the agenda. Thank you, and all the best for the future.
Merci. Slovo má nyní pan Strejček na 2 minuty.
And now Mr. Strejček for 2 minutes, please.
Pane předsedající, pane komisaři.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner, we are talking today about an economic package but also a political package of quite controversial proposals which should be a step forward, quite a decisive step in cooperation on taxation. Tax evasion is definitely a factor which threatens national budgets, but what are the causes of tax evasion and what is the motivation of those who take those steps, who resort to them? The first cause is high taxes. The higher the tax that I am due to pay, the higher my motivation to bypass that tax. And we should never forget about it when we consider steps to combat tax evasion, especially when most politicians today think that when they have a shortfall in budget, instead of cutting certain expenses, they think they will just tax more and everything will be resolved. And I would like to have one more remark. The tax paradise, the offshore centers exist because people move their money there. If you want to reduce tax evasion, lower taxes. The second cause is that the tax systems are not transparent, are complicated, and the more exceptions, the more evasion, the more fraud. For example, if it is too complicated to pay the VAT, many people who do not pay it correctly do so due to a large number of exceptions and derogations and due to the system being too complicated, but most member states do not promote corrections to their VAT systems which could simplify them. Other controversial steps are the obligatory of automatic transfers of information. Secondly, obligatory information about the taxpayer. These are sensitive informations, yet they are to be exchanged. Thirdly, for the first time, we have an obligatory exchange of information to any taxpayer. And the fourth controversial matter is the break of the banking secrecy. I also thank you. I am quite patient. Mr. Portas, 1 minute.
President, this is a very important debate, because what the governments and what the Commission have told us is that in the next few years, getting out of the crisis will depend on severe cuts in public investment and severe cuts in social spending. We keep hearing in the different reports emanating from the European Union that that's the way to go. But there is another way which could satisfy everybody, or could certainly satisfy honest taxpayers. And that would be to finish forever with tax havens and do away with tax evasion forever. But a system exploited by the banking system and by big companies. And that way we could tackle the revenue crisis, because so much revenue is going lost through tax fraud, through tax havens. And also, I think we have to put an end to banking secrecy for the same reason. I think a little bit of justice in the economy wouldn't do anybody any harm.
Mr. KARINŠ for 2 minutes.
Highly honoured Chairman, highly honoured Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, the question is not about whether we are against or for fight against tax evasion. Of course we are supporting fight against tax evasion, but the question is about the ways how we can achieve that. Now we can see that there are member states which are very reluctant exchanging information about their taxpayers with other member states. The proposal we are discussing now is about the introduction of automatic information exchange when all information about all taxpayers will be exchanged between the tax administrations of member states. I believe the important thing is that whenever we exchange the information, we should not increase administrative apparatus and the red tape. We are in the crisis. The unemployment in Spain is close to 20%. In Latvia, that level is higher than 20%. In other member states, we can see unemployment rates around 10% and more. As a result, member states are forced to cut their expenditure, which is contrary to the aim to reduce administrative apparatus, because in order to introduce this automatic information exchange, we will have to recruit more civil servants. I believe that European taxpayers are not able to carry this burden. Another proposal which we should consider is as follows. Maybe instead of exchanging all information, we should think about the information exchange based on request. That would be automatic information exchange based on request. Thank you.
Madam McCarthy, for 2 minutes.
Thank you. With over €200 billion lost annually, combating tax fraud and tax evasion in the EU must continue to be a priority for this Parliament, the European Commission and Member State governments. And colleagues, I can't believe that anyone in this House believes that a right to privacy is the right to evade tax. There is, of course, a global consensus that a lack of good governance in tax matters encourages tax fraud and tax evasion. Tax fraud has a major impact on national budgets. It robs public services, health, education and research of vital resources. Moreover, according to a major charity, tax evasion by the super-rich and global corporations has a severe impact on the lives of more than 5 million children in the developing world. Governments in the poorest developing countries are being swindled out of €92 billion a year in tax revenues, while the World Bank estimates that just a third of that, €30 to €4 billion, would pay for the UN's Millennium Development Goals. More shockingly still, a UK charity, Christian Aid, maintains that around €7 trillion are hidden away in tax havens. Therefore, the actions and recommendations proposed in these reports are essential to supporting a level playing field and to tackle distortions and abuses which underpin those systems of tax evasion and fraud. Assets held offshore are now equal to a third of global assets.
Sorry, Arlene, could you slow down a little bit for the translation? Thank you.
Half of the world's trade passes through tax havens, and action to crack down is already being stepped up. Tax havens are under investigation, with proposals in the EU and in the OECD being taken forward. Stronger tax cooperation is the only way forward. This does not weaken national sovereignty, but on the contrary strengthens and enhances national tax systems, stopping those who seek to undermine the integrity and functioning of those systems. And if we have learned one lesson from the global financial crisis, it is that we need more openness and transparency on financial transactions. That is why I support the proposals to move towards a global agreement and standard on automatic exchange of tax information tabled by our rapporteurs. Can I finish by saying that those who seek to water down these proposals, hiding behind scaremongering on data privacy, are neither serious nor ambitious in supporting global action to tackle the scourge of tax evasion, nor to promote good governance, good citizenship and social responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you. Herr Klinz, 1,5 Minuten, bitte.
Herr Präsident, liebe Kollegen.
1.5 minutes for Mr. Klinz. It's no mere peccadillo to evade VAT. It's a serious act, and over the course of time, according to the latest statistics, it might go up to €100 billion lost per year. And in times of public excessive debt and the crisis, citizens will fail to understand that the EU hasn't managed to deal with this problem successfully. That's why I welcome a fresh attempt being made here, and in the votes we take tomorrow, we will try and deal with the issue of evading VAT and other taxes. Now, whether this in fact increases VAT revenues and stops fresh fraud cases, we have to wait and see, but it's certainly worth the attempt. The results will run up to 2014, at which temporary stoppage we will have to take stock. But I think when there is inspections of VAT, we should pursue action against people who have avoided VAT. I regret the fact that my amendments didn't attract support in Econ.
Auch für die Zeitbehaltung.
Thank you for keeping to the time.
2 minutes. Madam Ford.
Thank you. Tax fraud is a crime that not only rubs governments, but also rubs every single taxpayer, every single citizen who does pay their tax on time. There has been much good work by the OECD, the G20, indeed the various rapporteurs in the European Parliament to help on the work to help combating tax fraud. I'd like to speak specifically on Mr Domenici's report and to thank him for the great transparency that he has shown in working together across the Parliament to improve this document. However, I do have 3 concerns. The first one is that combating tax fraud should not be used as a backdoor excuse for those who want to open up the debate on tax harmonisation across the EU. There is wording in the document about the common consolidated corporate tax base, and I think we should wait until the Commission comes to us later on this year with their impact assessment before jumping to conclusion on any of the pros and cons of that debate. The second point is on the controversial one of exchange of information. It is very clear that in certain circumstances, better exchange is needed, and indeed, like the savings tax, the automatic exchange does have benefits. This document goes much wider and demands automatic exchange in all areas. I'd rather see we can look at each specific circumstance for where we need it. Thirdly, the Domenici report suggests an EU-wide levy on financial movements to and from certain jurisdictions. There are different sanctions and different incentives, as the Commission has pointed out, that could be used to promote good behaviour in this area. I am very concerned that we could be going back with just one suggestion, which could be hugely controversial, by having these words about an EU-level levy.
Thank you. Mr. FEIO, 2 minutes.
Obrigado, Sr. Presidente. Ao tratarmos destes...
Thank you, President. Well, in debating these 4 reports, we're looking at a very clear structure here against tax evasion. But at the same time, we have to bear in mind a number of profound political problems. First of all, fraud and tax evasion will always exist. Now, out of respect to taxpayers who obey the rules, we have to combat fraud and tax evasion. Now, this particular matter is not specifically connected to the crisis. It's a question of public policy and public ethics. It's a problem which the European Union and the Member States have to tackle together. And in order to tackle tax evasion, we have to have tax cooperation if we're going to help our economy, our European economy, grow. Now, to achieve all this, we need simple legislation, transparent legislation, and also the administrations have to be able to do their job properly. Now, to do this, we need an exchange of information. Now, a number of international organisations are watching these proposals with interest, especially the OECD. And the OECD would certainly agree that we have to have an exchange of information, automatic exchange of information, when it comes to tax evasion and tax fraud. Also, when it comes to tax havens, this is a problem we have to tackle with determination. And this is already being done in the DG20. And any measure taken in this area have to be appropriate, professional and effective.
Madam Ferreira, for 2 minutes.
President, Commissioner, there are some facts we should recall. According to the OECD, the tax havens in 2008 were holding 7 to 8 trillion euros. And that's a considerable percentage of the overall wealth of the European Union, about 2% perhaps of the European Union's wealth. And at the same time we're going through a dreadful crisis, and that is also really has also led to even more use of tax havens, tax evasion, tax fraud by both banks and companies. At the same time, though, we're learning fast. We're drawing lessons from what has happened. We now have initiatives being taken by the IMF, the D20, the Financial Stability Forum, and now the European Union. The European Union has now taken a number of initiatives under the leadership of Mr. Kovács. I welcome these initiatives. We've had the Savings Directive, we've had codes of conduct, we've had directives on for increased cooperation. We've had increased cooperation between individual countries such as Belgium, Luxembourg, Austria, and joint efforts to tackle tax havens such as Monaco and Liechtenstein. At the same time, though, we still have to achieve what Mr. Domenici is calling for. The thing is, an awful lot of things have to change. And what has been happening up until now is a lot of things have changed, but as it were, everything's remained the same. And this has got to, as everything's remained the same, and this has got to stop. We have to have effective cooperation between tax organisations. SMEs have once again to have access to credit and to loans. And that's to say, we have to learn the lessons from this crisis and from the tax evasion and tax fraud we have seen, so that we can have a level playing field, a fair playing field for the European economies in the European Union. And here I think the proposals or the suggestions made by Alvarez and Domenici are taking us in the right direction. And I think their proposals merit the support of the members of this Parliament. I'm just finishing, President. I believe that these proposals, if correctly adjusted, will allow us to tackle the problems we've identified during the crisis and over the years of so many years of tax evasion and tax fraud. Thank you.
Obrigado. Mr. Schmidt for 1.5 minutes.
Herr talman, skatter är en känslig fråga, det vet vi och det hör vi. Det är en nationell fråga.
Member states rightly believe that tax issue is not a mere national issue, but under the impetus of the crisis, cooperation is increasingly necessary. Tax cooperation can be positive, provided that it follows a set of rules and no member state individually benefits from it. Tax evasion is illegal and immoral, and it creates difficulty for so many different countries. One can, of course, be critical about the tax system in your own country, but in this circumstance you need to fight it domestically, and you shouldn't simply try and evade taxes. More effective data exchange means automatic data exchange. Member states shouldn't allow tax havens, and that's why we need to be able to fight domestically to improve transparency, openness and cooperation on tax issues. And of course we must respect privacy at the same time. We also must avoid excessive red tape, which requires us to have a sound legal basis. rightly member states will have to stick to a limit.
Mr. Kovács, Commissioner for 18 hours more or whatever, I think it has been a privilege to cooperate with you. You didn't reach it all, but you did your best. Thank you and good luck.
Thank you. Pan WŁOSOWICZ, na minutkę.
Panie Przewodniczący.
President, Commissioner, colleagues. In the sixth term of office, the European Commission adopted a number of legislative motions related to tax frauds and tax evasion in the European Union. What is key here is the motion related to the directive on administrative cooperation in the field of taxation. I believe that thanks to the fact that almost all member states have said yes to it, the existing directive was definitely the first step towards such administrative cooperation, even though definitely certain things were not perfect. The report, the motion that we are dealing with at the moment, talks about increased sovereignty of individual member states when it comes to taxation by way of more effective management of own funds obtained from taxation, and also deeper integration at the level of the EU, which is so necessary. I believe that from political, economic and administrative view it's very important. Thank you.
Dziękuję. Herr Mann, bitte, für 2 Minuten.
Und vielen Dank auch Herrn Kommissar Kovács.
Thank you to you, Commissioner Kovács, for your excellent work. The subject I'd like to talk about is administrative cooperation between member states when it comes to taxes. This is a very ambitious project. It's also important because tax evasion is no mere peccadillo. It actually affects countries across borders. It's important to fight against tax evasion and tax fraud, both in member states and, of course, in dubious tax havens. The idea is that member states cannot solve everything at the European level is a blatant error. The fact that data can be purchased illegally from those involved in tax evasion, as has been happening in Germany, shouldn't be our only line of attack. In the directive, there's also a proposal on automatic exchange of information between tax authorities. Secondly, there are also reinforced procedures for exchanging staff between national tax administrations. And thirdly, a very urgent measure involving removing the possibility for bank secrecy, including beyond the European Union. There's something of a conflict, obviously, when it comes to automatic exchange of data on the one hand and confidentiality of personal data. It's important that we strike a balance, and we shouldn't allow one side to weigh more in this balance. At the same time, it's important that cross-border dual taxation be the subject of greater focus. I've spoken to a series of small and medium-sized enterprises who are involved in different member states. They say that the situation is far too complicated, there's not enough transparency, they don't have the elements they need to take accurate decisions. This is why we have to reduce red tape and making things more transparent so that tax administrations can help businesses work together and simplify their procedures. If we can bring about concrete steps towards simplification in the everyday life of businessmen, I think that'll take us a major step towards our objective.
As you can see, our board is working again, so I would like to thank our technicians. And now I will ask Mr. Cutaș to speak for 2 minutes.
Mulțumesc, domnule președinte.
Thank you very much, President. Our debate on taxation reforms takes place in a context which affects tax policies. The economic and financial crisis leads to an excessive deficit all over the world, and so the resources of budgets decrease. The last reports show that tax fraud is worrying in the EU. It's over 200 billion euros a year. Our colleagues who worked on these reports, and whom I salute, confront us with the dimension of this fraud. The economic recovery plan of the European Commission amounts to 1% of the GDP. I feel that the current situation imposes closer cooperation between member states, because the crisis showed the negative side of interdependence between national economies. These draft directives are a step forward for the EU legislation. In this regard, an automatic exchange of information, the elimination of banking secrecy, and improving mutual assistance for recovery of claims can represent very important steps for good cooperation between the 27 member states. And I'd like to wish Mr. Kovács a lot of success in his future activity.
Mr. Haglund for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, President. During this period of recession, worldwide tax revenue has been hit hard, and against this backdrop, this type of proposal is extremely welcome. In a single market, there is clearly no justification for anybody concealing taxable income, either in their own member state or elsewhere. Every year, member states lose billions of euros of tax revenue, and one of the main reasons for this is a lack of exchange of information between member states. In some member states, revenue is being concealed so as not to pay tax elsewhere. In some cases, legislation in certain member states makes it possible for people to conceal their revenue. I understand that some member states earn money from this, but is that a credible argument? No, it's not. We have to promote international cooperation in the field of tax. We have to work together to draft international regulations to help avoid tax fraud at both the EU and global levels. At the same time, I would like to remind you that many people attach great importance to protection of confidentiality, their personal integrity. And I think that's also an important aspect which we have to bear in mind.
Madam Pietikäinen for 2 minutes.
Mr. President, I think it has been painstakingly clear in this economic crisis that we either fail separately in the EU or we gain together. And it has been a very long process to get to the point that we really would have a proper automatic exchange of information in concerning taxation issues in the EU, and full transparency with effective administrative cooperation between the officials and nation states. And while we are asking the private sector and the banks to be more transparent and more reliable after the financial crisis, I really do think that we would need to urge it from our nation states and ourselves. And so I congratulate the next steps that have been taken here, but there's a long way to go. Plus, I urge the Commission to be very ambitious and very strong concerning the international cooperation, to have an international agreement on tax havens and automatic exchange of information.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly for 2 minutes.
Taxation is absolutely vital for the running of countries. I think most citizens would agree with that. But nevertheless, many citizens don't welcome the paying of taxes with open arms and with a smile. And this goes back right to the time of our Lord, when he pointed out that one of the most despised species at his time was the tax collector, who was seen as a villain. Now, I'm not sure has their status gone up a whole pile in the meantime. Now they're regarded as revenue commissioners, but certainly they wouldn't probably win any popularity contest. Nevertheless, side by side with that is the fact that historically those who evaded tax were sometimes seen as almost heroes, outfoxing the government. Now thankfully that too is changing, But at the same time, taxation evasion is rife throughout the country and throughout the world. And even in my own country, in the 80s and 90s, the banks themselves were providing offshore addresses for people for the purpose of evading tax. Of course, when that was found out, then of course the individual had to pay. Now, what needs to happen in the future is to ensure that tax evasion is cut down. The OECD estimates that 2.5% of global GDP is lost through tax evasion. Cigarette smuggling is a case in point, where cigarettes have moved from low tax to high tax economies, causing terrible damage to the health and of course also to the finances. Now, at the same time, the EU is limited by what it can do, because the Lisbon Treaty does not give it great competences in the area of tax, and that came up in the Lisbon Treaty in the guarantees given to Ireland. So for that reason, there can be no common consolidated corporate tax base, and the principle of fair tax competition must remain. So what we have to do is, by collaboration, cooperation, conviction, persuasion, try and get things moving ahead, but we cannot do it by compulsion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kelly. Now, Madam ESSAYAH for 2 minutes.
Arvoisa puhemies,
Chairman, with the proposal at hand, we have been doing some good work in order to fight against tax fraud and evasion and to improve cooperation between administrators. We have to remember that taxation is not a value per se, but it is a tool in order to pursue objectives, to tax harmful activities and to create a basis for carrying out welfare services. A good tax system is based on a just and broad tax basis and a level of taxation that is proportional. Tax evasion and tax fraud are eating up this tax base and make honest people pay the taxes. Public economies are in a crisis in different areas of the European Union. With tax evasion and tax fraud, public economies are cut down by about 200 billion euros, and we cannot really afford this. A couple of comments on the motions themselves or reports themselves. When we think about the means to combat VAT fraud, we have to remember the principles of proportionality, and David Casa's report sums these up very well. It is a very fair way to concentrate on reverse charge mechanisms that concentrates on certain goods and services susceptible to fraud. And it is important to give this option for member states. Then administrative cooperation is something by which we can complement national legislation, but we have to remember that we cannot substitute national legislation or even make them come closer to each other. Perhaps the most controversial subject regarding this directive has been exchange of information between tax administrations. Well-functioning exchange of information is important. It enhances the combat against tax fraud and evasion. In Finland, this functions well, and Finland is one of the least corrupt countries of the world, and therefore we cannot see this as such an important issue threatening the privacy and fundamental rights of citizens, as some people seem to do here at the moment. Thank you.
Sehr geehrter Kommissar Kovács,
Commissioner, financial legislation, of course, is a national responsibility, and this stimulates the egotism of the member states, therefore. And I think here in the European Union, we should be thinking in terms of how we're going to guarantee all the freedoms in the internal market. And one of the main problems we have to tackle here is dual taxation, especially for SMEs. The SMEs, they can't keep track of all the different legislations here in the European Union. And it's difficult, therefore, for them to offer their services in other countries in the European Union. It's complicated, bureaucratically. So what we need is a set of transparent regulations so that it's easy for SMEs to legitimately avoid dual taxation. and that would do a service to the internal market and to SMEs. It would be a good idea if we had a one-stop shop for SMEs in this regard, so that they would have an office of bureaucracy they could go to, so that they could efficiently and transparently deal with their cross-border tax questions.
Domnule președinte, aș vrea să mă refer.
Thank you very much, President. I would like to refer to systems for electronic governments which have been used in various member states. For example, e-payments of taxes, VAT payments, which are done electronically, and e-billing. We're talking about the new digital agenda for the following 5 years, and the member states need to use IT technology in order to improve administrative cooperation in taxation. I think that, at least as concerns e-billing, there is a high-level group which in November of last year drafted a report with recommendations towards the European Commission. Commissioner Tajani promised to take an initiative to support e-billing so that this would be widely adopted among the member states. I would like to ask the Commission when this proposal is going to arrive.
Mr. Griffin.
Chairman, discussing tax cooperation during the current euro crisis is rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. The southern nations are known in English by the harsh acronym PIGS, but those being crucified on the euro are not pigs but people, scourged by utopian one-size-fits-all dogma. Their economies will either die of 1,000 cuts or be bailed out, to the ruin of taxpayers in Britain and elsewhere. There will be very little tax to cooperate over. There are two ways out: abolish the euro and return to the captive nations of this strawberry Soviet their own currencies, or expel the problem countries from the euro. That might be the pigs. More justly, it will be Germany and her French collaborator, because running the euro according to German interests is the root of this shambles. This endless crisis will destroy the federal project, tax cooperation and all. The tragedy is that it will grind so many innocent victims into poverty before it does so. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Băsescu.
I would like to congratulate the rapporteur, Mr. Stolojan, for his work on his report on the recovery of claims. We need a common legislation uniformly applied throughout the EU so as to fight against fraud and tax evasion. The internal market and the budget of any member states can be negatively affected by the non-payment of duties and taxes. The free movement of capital and persons required the extension of the scope of this legislation, and starting with the beginning of this year we will include here the mandatory contributions to the system of social security. An important step towards the recovery of claims in the EU is the rapid exchange of information. Given that we will have common standard instruments and forms to be translated in all official languages of the EU, well, this will facilitate the daily work of competent authority. An automatic common system will lead to lower costs and more efficiency. Thank you.
Mulțumesc. Herr Bullmann, bitte.
Wenn wir heute Frau Alvarez
Mr. Alvarez, Mrs. Alvarez, Mr. Domenici have been congratulated on their excellent reports, and we've congratulated Commissioner Kovács on his excellent work, and we've wished him all the best for the future. We've expressed the hope that his passion for more common tax policy will be passed on to his successor. But if we've done all that, then we have to mention the Member States too. The Member States who continue to lag behind and refrain from doing what in this crisis situation they really have to do, which is finally to usher in better cooperation. It's unbelievable that we've made no progress on a common consolidated tax basis yet. Surely sovereignty on this basis is going to make everyone a loser in terms of tax revenues. In these reports, we've called for more tax cooperation in Europe. That can only make us progress.
Und der Herr Theurer, auch eine Minute.
Vielen Dank, Herr Präsident, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen.
Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen, the fight against tax fraud is something which we have to do. However, tax fraud and tax evasion are not the primary cause, of course, for economic crisis. I would like to take this opportunity to make it clear that the first thing we have to do is to adopt simple, transparent, easy to understand tax systems so as to bring back a sense of taxpayers' confidence. This does not mean, however, that we shouldn't actively fight against efforts to evade or defraud tax systems, since that does, of course, rob treasures of revenue and undermine confidence. In Switzerland, the fear has been voiced that Switzerland might be put under pressure by the European Union. I would like to know whether any proposals have been made or already actually in place to put Switzerland under pressure. My view is that Switzerland can't afford to treat the European Union any less well than the United States. This means that we have to ensure that Switzerland be actively involved in a substantive system designed to fight against tax fraud.
To wrap up the discussion and answer some of the questions. Commissioner, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, honourable members. I have found the debate interesting and also inspiring. Like most of you, I am persuaded that our efforts to combat tax fraud and evasion and to increase tax cooperation are worthwhile. I am grateful for your support and for the work of the 4 rapporteurs, and I am very grateful for the support to these important initiatives of the Commission. Promoting good governance in tax matters is a complicated dossier containing several different issues. Your reports have covered virtually all of them, from the formal legislative proposal promoting administrative cooperation to our work with third countries. I was pleased to hear that many of you encouraged the Commission to be more ambitious. I fully agree with you, and I am sure that with your support and with that of the governments of the Member States, the new Commission will be able to tackle the challenges ahead. I know that these files remain a priority for my successor. The Commission, the Parliament and the Council should continue efforts for the approval of the legislative proposals which are on the table or in the pipeline, and the work of the group of the Code of Conduct on business taxation. On the external aspects of the principles of good governance in tax matters, all actions mentioned in the communication should be promoted, with special attention to those related to developing countries. As regards the specific proposals on administrative cooperation, mutual assistance in the recovery of tax claims, and the optional and temporary application of the reverse charge mechanism, I also want to thank you for your comments and views. I am glad to see that the European Parliament and the Commission share views on actions to be undertaken to better combat tax fraud and evasion in the European Union and beyond. I also see general support for the 3 proposals. Achieving rapid progress and unanimous agreement on the proposal on administrative cooperation is one of the priorities of the Spanish presidency. It is also now a priority for most Member States. The EU urgently needs to reach a unanimous agreement internally to be able to show on the international scene its determination to move ahead from the OECD standard and the G20 recommendations and pave the way for a future evolution at international level by proving it is able to develop a fully fledged administrative cooperation. It is clear that there is no one single and global solution for eliminating tax fraud and evasion, but the proposals we have discussed today are important steps forward within the framework of the anti-tax fraud strategy of the European Union. Finally, just one day before the end of the mandate, I would like to repeat my thanks for the support to the tax and customs initiatives of the Commission, and in particular for the cooperation of ECON and IMCO committees. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Commissioner. Madam Alvarez.
Thank you very much, President. I'd like to refer to the reasons why we're going beyond the OECD standards on automatic exchange of data. There are many, many arguments that one could bring to bear, but clearly the OECD model was designed to work in a broader framework of international relations, and the rules of engagement are very different from those in the EU. In the EU, we have a single economic space, as Mr. Kovács said, in which fiscal data should be able to circulate as freely as its citizens and in the way that member states apply their fiscal systems. So there shouldn't be any obstacle of this kind in the way of goods and services, and so there shouldn't be in turn for fiscal data. The member states have engaged in a political project, and the relationship between their taxation systems should be harmonized through this political project. So beyond the practical imperative, the operation of this market puts us before a question of principle. So I'd like to stress the idea of fiscal sovereignty and the way in which we combat fraud, and that should be the way in which we work against fraud should be strengthened rather than undermined. Member states will have more sovereignty because they'll have more effective instruments to be able to apply their own fiscal measures. So then, this is a matter that should be taken into account, and for that reason we should support the directive. I'd also like to point out that, as Mr. Klint said, fraud is a crime, and it can't be justified through such weak arguments as that there might be high levels of taxation and different levels of taxation across the member states. If we want to reduce taxation fraud, we should be able to reduce taxation in turn. So then that's a reason to apply this system. And finally, I would point out the important deterrent effect of the 4 reports that we're supporting towards the directive. Because if taxpayers are aware that legislation is there which is plugging these loopholes and stopping fraudsters and crime, then there will be more support for it. So then we should have more instruments, more effective instruments to continue combating fraud. And lastly, I'd like to say how timely this measure is. The economic crisis has shown that this phenomenon can spread from one country to another, and we need to have stimuli and incentives. And I would point out Mr. Lambert's suggestion. At the current time, we need to make greater efforts to try and stimulate the economy and provide social benefits to offset the effects of the crisis. The member states are today more than ever aware of the seriousness of taxation and fiscal fraud and its serious impact on the economy, and they insist on having the necessary measures to combat these problems. Thank you.
Gracias. Now Mr. Stolojan.
Mulțumesc, domnule președinte. Am ascultat cu atenție punctele de vedere ale colegilor.
Thank you very much. I've listened very carefully to what all my colleagues have said, and I recognize that they have been fairly cautious with regard to automatic exchange of information. However, I'm convinced that with all the European citizens who pay their taxes correctly, I think we in the European institutions need to show that we are determined to take all the necessary measures to minimize tax evasion and to ensure that decisions that are taken for recovery of taxes due can be carried out whichever member state we are talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. Now Mr. CASA for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam President.
even I have followed the debate with attention, and I think if I had to make a conclusion of this debate, an important debate, I think that we all agree that we should use any means possible to fight against tax evasion and against fraud in various countries. We have to use measures as proposed today without harming the commerce sector, especially SMEs, and without increasing bureaucracy. I think we should continue to reduce bureaucracy that is harming the commercial sector. And we have to do this without penalizing those who are honest, those citizens who are honest to pay taxes and who do not evade tax. Not just citizens, but also businessmen. Those who carry out trade between one country and another, those who are not evading tax and who are not criminals. And I think that with these proposals, I think we're going to strengthen the credibility of the ETS, emission trading scheme, and its related payments. At the same time, I think that we should reduce the administrative burden of honest businessmen, and we are also ensuring that Parliament is kept informed on the whole process as it is adopting this reverse charge mechanism. Like my colleagues, I would like to thank the Commissioner for all the work carried out in the past years. We have not always agreed with what you've said, but I think looking back, when we look at the taxation sector, we have a more efficient system and a better and more just system for the European citizens. Thank you.
Domenici for 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everybody who has made their nice comments on the report, which was very much a collaborative effort, and I do hope this means that we are going to get a positive vote on it in the European Parliament. I think that the report should be, all our reports should be supported. Mr. CASA and Ms. Stolojan have said so too, really in the name of all our honest taxpayer citizens who are the first to pay the price for fraud, tax fraud and tax avoidance. And the idea is that we all pay so that all of us can pay less. Now, at the beginning of this discussion, we heard of a tax colonoscopy. Now, we all know that a colonoscopy is never going to be a particularly nice intervention, even though it might be very useful in some ways. But we do have to make sure that we do look at everything, that we make sure that income tax is paid and that one's legal obligations are met. We do sometimes have to use public money. We don't want to, but sometimes governments do have to use that public money to save banks and other financial institutions who have speculated.
Group of Socialists and Democrats, I would thank Commissioner Kovács for his good cooperation and collaboration during the last 5 years.
Thank you very much. The joint debate is now closed, and the vote will take place at 12 o'clock on Wednesday. So we now move to the next item on the agenda, which is the Commission statement on GM Opel and current developments. And if I just give the Commission time to change seats, and then Commissioner Špidla, the floor will be yours.
Mesdames et Messieurs, le présent.
Ladies and gentlemen, this debate is of major importance to the European general public. Public financing, the restructuring of the Opel Vauxhall Group, by one or more European governments. The Commission has been following the matter closely since July 2009, when Commissioner Kroes and I spoke to you here in the European Parliament about the case of the Opel Vauxhall Group. The Commission has also organised a number of informal meetings with European ministers on the subject. And as you know, in autumn of 2009, General Motors decided to keep Opel Vauxhall and to proceed to restructure the firm. At the end of November 2009, General Motors presented a restructuring plan to the services responsible for competition matters in the European Commission. Although the role of the Commission does not normally involve an ex-ante assessment of industrial and trade logic, in the case of restructuring, and in the absence of information in the Member States about the actual potential success of the plan, the Commission services undertook an assessment following a request from the Competitiveness Council. Based on the contents of the General Motors plan of restructuring and the information provided to the Commission, it seems that the restructuring plan is not based on considerations which are non-economic, in other words, would harm the future viability of the European operations of the Opel Vauxhall Group. The present General Motors plan has a number of common features, that is with other restructuring plans prepared previously by General Motors itself, with other interested investors, and in some key areas. In line with earlier decisions taken by General Motors, taken before the beginning of the crisis, particularly with regard to applying a given model to a given plant site, General Motors explained the economic justification of its decisions with regard to the reorganization of production installations throughout Europe, referring to the specific situation of individual plants. The decisions seem to be motivated by considerations with regard to the range of models which will be affected in different sites in Europe, and the length of a production line for the different models produced at present in more than one plant. The low level of additional investing with increased centralization of production for a given model, and also looking at the supplier and component side of the problem. General Motors still has to discuss this plan further with representatives of the workers, who would have to enter into a commitment so that significant cost cutting could take place in Europe. The Commission will remain vigilant to be sure that if state aids are involved, the restructuring of Opel Vauxhall will still be based on economic considerations and will not be influenced by conditions which are not commercial and which are linked with state financing, and in particular that the geographical breakdown of this restructuring should not be affected by political considerations. The Commission, of course, will continue to follow very closely any developments in the Opel Group, and in this context you will certainly be aware that in January 2010 General Motors officially announced its intention to close down the Antwerp plant in 2010. I understand the concerns you have about this announcement and the number of jobs which will be lost at that plant. It is very sad to note